Thank you, Amanda. It's so good to have you back again today. It's kind of tricky when we have this online thing, isn't it, to be right at 11:59. I was like, yes, girl, you got it. And good morning and welcome to all of you who are joining us online this morning. Hey, I just want to send a special shout out today. This is kind of fun. One of the things I love about the online community is that I know some of you are watching, and we have 4 of the Lane sisters here today, and we know that the 5th Lane sister is sitting down there in College Station, Maryland and Newton. We want to send a shout out from all of your sisters that are sitting here in our congregation today, and know that how fun that we're connected even across the miles and being with one another. Well, we are on a journey. This whole Lenten season, we've been on a journey through the Gospel of Luke. And we said that the Gospel is so interesting because all Gospels, as a matter of fact, were written from various perspectives. They were written with a point of view. And so Luke's community, which we think was probably predominantly Gentile, was written in about 85 CE, was probably in Antioch, was seeking to understand the stories of Jesus that they heard. They were trying to emulate this life on the way. Remember, as early as really probably only 100, they were starting to call them Christians. And the word was used as really a not so very nice term. But before that, if you were involved in what we now would call the Christian movement, you were followers of the way. And I always love that because I believe and I teach that Jesus has come to teach us a way in which to understand, to open our concepts and our understanding of who and what it is in God and that relationship. And he tells us, Luke that is, our author says, spirituality is a journey. We don't just one day wake up and say, okay, today's my day to get spiritual, and I am, and I checked it off the box. Rather, it's an ongoing evolutionary. I like to think of it as, as we awaken and we grow and we mature, life happens, we have greater understandings, we come into new teachings. Our sense of God and who and what God is broadens over the course of time. So the question Luke has for his community, reflecting the question from his community, is what does it mean now to be a disciple on the way? And last week we looked at the story, the lost trilogy, the lost sheep, coin, and son. And we said, what happens when you fall off the way? Is there a way to get back? And what was so intriguing about all 3 of those stories was that end refrain, and there was rejoicing for the one who was lost, for the coin that was lost, for the sheep that was lost, was found. That had to give such comfort to those disciples who got caught up in the world around them and were no longer, or from their perspective, living a spiritual life. And so they struggled with what it meant. Could they come back into this community? Could they be a part of it? Could they still be a follower of the way? And the story tells us very clearly, yes, come home. Come home. You're always welcome here. Well, there's, of course, a plethora of stories in the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to look at another story today. Actually, we're going to kind of compare and contrast 2 stories. Because also what happens is, Jesus is a master teacher. And so he is constantly being asked, sort of what you teach and what you're all about. And we want to understand how this master teacher helped people grow spiritually. The 2 stories, one is found in Luke 10, beginning at 25, probably a story most of you are familiar with, the Good Samaritan. The second story is found in Luke 18:18. It starts at 18:18. It's called The Rich Young Man. Now, both stories are very, very interesting because they ask important questions. Both people that encounter Jesus come up and say, "Teacher, Master, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, unfortunately, typically we think about these two stories, which have many parallel passages, as kind of snarky. The guy comes up, Master, what should I do to gain eternal life? And I'm going to ask you to look and see that just maybe these two people were really, truly sincere. They were lost on their spiritual journey, and they couldn't find their way, and they were attracted to something in Jesus that they saw that he had, or he understood, or a connection, if you will, to the divine that they hungered for, and they just couldn't get there. And they wondered, how did you do that? Teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life? So both stories start out telling us by the description, one was a lawyer, one was a rich young man, that we're talking about probably more educated people. We're talking about people who had some sort of prominence. They probably went to the temple. They may have been seated on the Sanhedrin. They were part of the establishment. So they knew what to do. Because the very second question is, Jesus says, well, what are you doing? Isn't that a legitimate question? It's a teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what are you now doing? So when they answer, they tell him that they have done the program. This is an important piece of information because Jesus does not say, really, that's what you've done? Or that's not a valid program, don't do that. Jesus reaffirms that there is a foundational teaching on which you grow. And that this is wonderful, this is great. You have started, you have got the foundation. You read the Torah, you go to temple, you practice the rituals, you do the prayers. Awesome. Okay, now you've got it. But with the rich young man, he says, but there's one thing you lack. With the lawyer, he says, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, a very rugged, rocky, desert climate road. And he was attacked, and he laid by the side of the road. In these two moments, Jesus takes a masterful shift, because basically what he's saying to both of them, one through telling him what he needs to do, and the other one inviting him to the opportunity to see what he needs to do. Basically what he's saying, the foundation is only a start. You got to move from all this head knowledge, where? To the heart. I'm going to challenge you to live the teaching. It's not good enough to recite chapter and verse. I want you to live the teaching. You just told me you know the teaching. Now I'm saying to you, live the teaching. That's the next step. That's the next piece of the journey. Remember, Luke has always got Jesus on a journey. We are on a journey. And we've got to move from all the things we know. I read all the Unity books. I go to church. I pray. I meditate. I do all. And that is important, foundational work. But the next thing is, you must live it. You must begin to live it. Now, in order to really understand the story of the Good Samaritan, you have to understand the punch of this story. When Jesus starts talking about the Good Samaritan, he talks about all the people who pass by. This man was wounded by the side of the road. He was in the hot, blazing sun because it is a very desert climate. It is on a high elevation. Jerusalem is, 3,200 feet above Jericho. And so this man is laying there just really, the buzzards are circling around, you know. I mean, this was a really intense place. And so the two people who should have helped him, the priest and the lawyers walk by. Now, we tend to think of this as kind of a callous thing, like, oh, no, I'm not. But we have to understand that part of what was the foundational principle laws was that when you touched someone who was bleeding, you were ritualistically unclean. And they weren't willing to risk that. So the third person comes along, and he's a Samaritan. Now, the Samaritans and the Jews, to this day, to this moment, to this hour, are still in confrontation with each other. We haven't gotten over it yet after all these years. Why? Why? See, this is important for you to understand. Think of the story in the Gospel of John, the woman at the well of Samaria. She was a Samaritan, and Jesus talked to her too. Because, and in that story tells you a better understanding. Once upon a time, they were one tribe. Does that sound like a problem waiting to happen? Once upon a time, they were one tribe. And when they moved into the promised land, they came to Shechem, and they said, we will worship God on Mount Gerizim. Great. A couple hundred years later, King David comes in. I'm going to solidify my kingdom. And my new capital is going to be Jerusalem. In a massive political move, because we always tend to think of David as, lambs and harps and the 23rd Psalm, but actually David was a ruthless warrior king. And he solidified the country, and he said, you're not going to worship God there. You're going to worship God in Jerusalem, and I'm going to build a temple. My son actually ended up building it, but it's going to be on this property. So there was a tension from 1000 BCE to this day between the Samaritans and the Jews. The Samaritans say, well, we worship God on Mount Gerizim, and we only follow the first 5 books of the Bible, which are known as the books of Moses. That's our Bible. And the Jews say, no, we've got Chronicles, Kings, we've got all the stories of empire that we've put in there too. That's the real Bible. And so there's all this conflict, all this tension that sits there. And so when the Samaritan becomes the hero of the story, everybody in the room zoned out, because the bad guy, who should not have helped the Jew by any way, shape, or form, becomes the hero of the story. And what does Jesus, these are such masterful stories. Remember, part of it is Jesus turns stories on their head, and that's why they're remembered to this day. He says, to the lawyer, he said, so there's the story. Who do you think was a neighbor to the beaten man? Well, what's the guy going to say? Now, let me think. Let's go over the story one more time. Is he shamed or what? I got it. And what does Jesus tell him? Now, this is the telling point. He says, go and do likewise. Who's your neighbor? Who's your neighbor? And in the story of the rich young man, he says, if you really, really want to understand me and understand the message that I'm teaching about God, you have to sell everything and come and follow me. Please understand, Jesus was not telling the guy to sell literally everything. What is he telling him to do? Disassociate, unattach himself from his worldly possessions, from his name, from his honor, that said, this is my egoic system in the world, and this is who I am. That's only one part of you. You are spirit. You are life eternal. So let's look at how we might understand this story in our language and in our time. Because you see, if we can't get the story to truly authentically speak to us, then it has no lasting eternal meaning. We might ask the question of Jesus, how can I live a more authentically, spiritually empowered life? That's our language. We don't say, good master, how do I gain eternal life? We say, how do I live a more authentic spiritual life? And Jesus would say to us, well, what do you do? What do you do now? What is it that you do? Well, I pray, I meditate, I come to church, I participate, I give to the poor, I do all these things, and he's great. Great. That is the foundation. But now I'm going to say to you, that's just head learning. What's your heart telling? How is your heart calling? Can you see your neighbor as one? Can you see that the attachment to your possessions are exactly what keeps you here in your egoic system as opposed to here in your heart? And sometimes we need sort of real life examples of these kinds of stories so they sort of help us understand a little bit more about what Jesus is talking about and really have the opportunity to call ourselves up short and say, you know, I think I'm living a more spiritually empowered life, but am I? It's early November last year, and we are in the city of Bratislava, the capital of Slovenia. Beautiful day, beautiful fall day. We'd taken a small tour of the city, walked around, checked out the tchotchke shops. We come to the center of the town. And our tour guide, Lucy, says to us, okay, well, you got about 2 hours before the bus comes back. You can go shopping if you go to the left, and if you want to go kind of tour the ancient city, the old walls, and there's a moldy old cathedral that's just beautiful. Now I'm a moldy old cathedral kind of girl myself, so I wanted to go see the moldy old cathedral and the ancient walls and walk around Bratislava. So a group of us, I think the whole group altogether was like 24, and probably about 10 of us walked around. You know, you can only shop so much, at least I can. I wanted to take pictures. You know, I want to go see this cathedral. So we walked along this wall and along the river, and it was a beautiful day. So we get to the cathedral. So, of course, you know, as a group of people walk, they start breaking up. You know, there's about 10 of them are back there, and Patrick and I are kind of, come on, let's go. So we walk into the cathedral, and the woman says to us, you know, silence. Mass in 10 minutes, which means whatever you're going to do, get it done because we're going to throw you out in 10 minutes. Okay, we got it. So we're walking around taking pictures. My cousins were with us, and we're doing our thing. And two women were kind of just taking their time. They were at the end of the group, Betsy and Judy. And they've been friends for a long time. And Betsy says, I'm going in. And Judy says, I'm going to take one more picture of the outside, one more picture of the outside. So as she's taking the picture outside, the greatest danger of doing anything while you're walking is what? Missing the step. This is an interesting cathedral because it had 3 steps down instead of 3 steps up, like most cathedrals do. It was on a hill. She missed the first step. It was a stone step, and the floor was stone. And she hit the side of her face when she fell. We did not see her because we were all in the cathedral. Nobody knew what happened. A few moments later, you know, as they're chasing us out, she's standing there and she's crying and, you know, and she's holding her face where her glasses have smacked the side of her face. And she's, you know how you are when you're just upset. She is absolutely breathless about trying, and she's pointing to a man who's begging by the door of the church. What do you think our assumption was? Here's a man begging, a bunch of American tourists not paying attention. We call that a scene ripe for pickpocketing. We don't know what's happened. We can't get it out of her. She's still breathless, all right? Finally, she calms down enough. And I want you to hear our perception, how the shifting in perception happens, okay? She finally calmed down enough to say, no, he rescued me. He saw me fall. But he was sitting, and he couldn't get up fast enough to save me from the impact. But she said, when I hit, he was standing right there. He got down on the floor with me, this man who probably hasn't had a bath in a week, she said, and he grabbed me, and in whatever broken English he could say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And of course, she was so rattled and confused. It's like, "No, I'm not okay. I don't know. Get my friend, get my friend." He signaled to Betsy, got her attention, and she came over. He helped her up. He went to look for her glasses because they'd fallen off her face, put them on her face, kind of hugged her like, "You're going to be okay. You know, you're going to be okay," and walked back to the mat and sat down. Finally, we got it. The Samaritan was the hero of the story. The one least likely to come to her rescue was the man who sat by the door waiting for some alms. I have to tell you, quite frankly, when I walked in the cathedral, I didn't even notice him. Because in my American, sort of mindset, I'm traveling, I'm getting pictures, I need to get into the cathedral, or whatever. He might have come later, I don't know, but I never even saw him. And suddenly now I see somebody. I see him as I've never seen him before. He's the hero of the story. And Judy is trying to get money out of her purse, but she's, kind of banged up and she's still sort of breathy. And finally, we got her calmed down enough to kind of tell us the whole story. She says, "I have to give him money. I have to give him money." Well, of course, you know what we did. We all gave him money. And he came up to her and he took her hand and he looked her in the eye. This man who didn't know her, a random act of kindness so deep and so profound. He lived the experience of his spiritual understanding. He became in that moment the one who saved, the one who exemplified grace and mercy and tenderness. And he grabbed her hand and he said, "Thank you. You feed my family for the day." That little act of kindness moved from just being a head experience, I know my Bible and I can preach it back and forth, to I'm going to live it. In a moment when I could have stepped back and said, "Oh, those Americans, they're always doing something crazy," and disassociated myself from it. Or he could have taken advantage of the situation, knowing that she fell, she didn't have her glasses, could have taken any money she had. He didn't do that. He came up and he said, "Let me help you. Are you okay?" And I think this story speaks to me so importantly because it tells me, it informs me of how my blinders go on. I had an assumption of what that man was doing and what he was all about, until the moment he became a friend. I have an assumption about things in life until the moment that it is revealed to me that my assumption is erroneous. And in those moments are the times when I'm privileged and humbled to say, "Wait a minute, I know the foundation, I know all the steps, but I only know this much about God. I only know how to live out this story in just a small way. And can I be more attentive to the stories of the hearts and the sufferings of those people around me? Maybe I can't do things for people in a literal physical way. I mean, let's face it. He knew we were tourists. We knew we were tourists. In the next nanosecond, we were walking away, would never, ever see that man again. And yet, his story touched our hearts. And yet, his story lives on as kind of a high watermark. It's like, Marianne, would you have done the same? Would you have been the one to be there? Or would you just say, well, somebody will come and rescue her. Somebody will come and take care of her. To risk coming out of my comfort zone is, in essence, is what he did to help her. So when we look at these stories in the Bible, we need to remind ourselves that every single story is a mere reflection and a teaching to us about us. It is, yes, in one sense, it's a story about the disciples and about Jesus so very long ago. But if it is not the story about our story, then the gospel author has wasted his time in putting all of that into pen. He wanted us to understand something very clearly. We can talk a good story, but until we walk the story, until we live the story, we don't have to ask the question, good teacher, what does it mean to live an empowered spiritual life? Because at that point, we have shifted from knowing that we stand firmly on the base, and we simply be that life and expression. He doesn't have to answer our question anymore, because our question is answered from within. Thank you for joining me today, and God bless.